Rain drummed against the white reception tent, steady and relentless, as conversations thinned into uneasy murmurs. The string quartet faltered mid-note. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the aisle, shoulders squared but pulse racing, his 6-year-old daughter Lily gripping the side of his suit jacket like it was the only solid thing in the world. He could feel her trembling through the fabric. Across the lawn, beneath crystal lights and towering floral arrangements, Caroline Mercer froze in the middle of her wedding toast. Champagne hovered inches from her lips. Her fiancé, Grant Holloway, scanned the crowd, confusion tightening his jaw. Beside Daniel stood Grace, poised in an emerald dress, chin lifted, dignity wrapped tighter than silk around her frame. A moment ago she had been smiling. "She doesn't even have an address," Caroline announced into the microphone, her voice cutting clean through the rain and music. Whispers spread like wildfire. Lily tugged gently. "Daddy, what's happening?" Daniel's throat burned. He had brought Grace here to prove he wasn't broken. Now the room felt like a courtroom. Grace stepped forward. "She's right," she said. The entire wedding fell silent. Subscribe to Just Dad Things for more powerful single dad stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel Mercer's alarm went off at 5 every morning, long before the sun reached the quiet streets of Ashford Hollow, Ohio. He did not hit snooze. He never did. There was no one else coming to take over if he stayed in bed. By 5:15, he was in the kitchen of his small rented house, flipping pancakes with one hand while scanning the stack of bills on the counter with the other. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee maker sputtered. Outside, the sky was still charcoal gray. At 6, he walked down the narrow hallway and tapped gently on Lily's bedroom door. "Sun's almost up, kiddo." A small voice answered from under the covers. 5 more minutes. He smiled despite the weight pressing on his chest. "You said that yesterday." When Lily finally padded into the kitchen in mismatched socks, her hair wild and her eyes still half asleep, Daniel felt the familiar tug in his chest. The reason he kept moving no matter how tired he felt. He braided her hair the best he could, though it always came out slightly crooked. He packed her lunch. He made sure her homework was in her backpack. He knelt in front of her before they left the house. "Good day today," he would say every morning. She would nod like she believed him. By 7:30, he dropped her at Ashford Hollow Elementary and drove straight to Mercer Auto Repair, the same shop his father had run for 30 years before a heart attack took him in the service bay. The sign out front was faded. The waiting room chairs did not match, but the shop was honest. Daniel had rebuilt engines, replaced transmissions, and worked through winter storms without missing a day. It was steady work, just not impressive work. 8 months earlier, Caroline had stood in that same kitchen and told him she needed more ambition, more growth, more future. She had not said his name with anger. She had said it with disappointment. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, she was engaged to Grant Holloway, a property developer from Columbus who had begun buying up commercial buildings in Ashford Hollow. Grant spoke in terms like expansion, equity, and scale. Daniel spoke in oil pressure and brake lines. The contrast had been impossible to ignore. The divorce had drained most of Daniel's savings. Legal fees, court filings, temporary support adjustments. Caroline's attorney had made one comment during negotiations that still echoed in Daniel's mind. "If your income fluctuates significantly, custody arrangements may be revisited." Daniel had not missed a payment. Not once. But business had slowed slightly since Grant's company purchased the vacant warehouse across from his shop. Rumors of redevelopment swirled. Daniel could not afford instability, because instability did not just mean embarrassment. It meant Lily. The wedding invitation had arrived in a thick cream envelope with gold lettering. "Caroline Mercer and Grant Holloway request the honor of your presence." Daniel had stared at it for 2 full days before opening it. Skipping the wedding would make him look bitter. Attending alone would make him look lonely. Looking unstable could quietly strengthen Caroline's position if custody ever returned to court. He did not care what the town thought. He cared what a judge might think. One evening, after closing the shop late, Daniel stepped outside to lock the side gate and noticed someone sitting near the alley wall beneath the security light. A woman. She was not holding a sign. She was not approaching customers. She was reading. A worn paperback rested in her hands, her fingers turning pages carefully like the book mattered. Over the next few days, he saw her again. Same spot. Same quiet presence. On the fourth evening, he walked over. "You're blocking my security camera," he said gently. She looked up, not startled, just calm. "It's a terrible angle anyway." That was how he met Grace Callahan. She had once worked as a registered nurse in a neighboring county hospital. Her mother had fallen ill, medical bills stacked, then layoffs came, then rent fell behind. It had not happened overnight. It had happened slowly, one setback at a time. She spoke without self-pity. "I'm not asking for anything," she told him once. "Just trying to get through." Daniel found himself sitting on the curb longer than he intended that night. He did not tell her about the wedding at first. He did not tell her about custody fears or pride. But he mentioned Caroline. He mentioned feeling small. Grace listened without judgment. The idea came to him impulsively, driven by a mix of wounded pride and practical fear. "I need someone to attend a wedding with me," he said carefully. "Just to show I'm fine." He offered her money, enough to help her secure temporary housing. Grace studied him for a long moment. "You want to prove something," she said. He did not deny it. She exhaled slowly. "If this turns into a lie, I walk away." He nodded, because beneath the pride, beneath the insecurity, beneath the fear of losing Lily, Daniel knew one thing clearly. He could not afford to look broken. Not in front of Caroline. Not in front of Grant. And definitely not in front of anyone who might one day decide where his daughter sleeps. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Ashford Hollow Country Club, a place Daniel had only ever driven past. Soft golden lights glowed from tall windows. Valets in pressed jackets moved briskly between polished cars. The air smelled faintly of trimmed hedges and expensive cologne. Daniel adjusted his tie in the reflection of his truck window before stepping out. Grace stood beside him in a simple navy dress they had found at a consignment boutique in the next town over. She looked composed, observant, never intimidated. Inside, laughter floated through the room like something rehearsed. Caroline stood near the fireplace, elegant in cream silk, greeting guests with effortless precision. She did not look cruel. She looked controlled. Every detail around her, from the floral arrangements to the guest list, felt curated. When her eyes landed on Daniel, there was a flicker of something complicated. Not anger, not regret. Assessment. "Daniel," she said warmly enough for others to hear, "I'm glad you came." Her smile never slipped, but there was distance in it. Polished distance. Grant Holloway joined them moments later. Taller than Daniel, clean-shaven, his handshake firm but measured. "Good to see you," Grant said. "Caroline's told me a lot about the shop." Daniel nodded. "Likewise." Grant's tone was not condescending. It was professional, evaluating. Daniel noticed the subtle difference in the way people responded to Grant. Conversations paused when he approached. Heads tilted slightly forward. He did not demand authority. It followed him naturally. Across the room, a small group discussed redevelopment plans. Daniel overheard words like expansion corridor, mixed-use retail, projected revenue growth. One of Grant's associates, a sharply dressed man with silver cufflinks, glanced toward Daniel's direction. "That auto shop near the South Block," the associate said casually. "Once we begin construction, small businesses like that usually struggle to keep up." Grant did not respond immediately. He simply took a sip of his drink. "Transition always creates opportunity," he said evenly. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. But Daniel felt it land like pressure against his ribs. Grace stood quietly at his side, absorbing every exchange. She did not interrupt. She did not shrink. Caroline turned slightly toward a group of guests and placed a gentle hand on Grant's arm. "Stability matters," she said, smiling, "especially when you're building something long-term." Her eyes briefly met Daniel's. The word stability lingered in the air longer than it should have. Daniel knew exactly what she meant. Caroline had always valued security, not emotional security, but structural. Predictability, scale, growth. Her new life reflected that philosophy. It was not malicious, it was aspirational, but it made Daniel feel like a relic from a smaller chapter. Throughout dinner, Daniel found himself answering polite questions. "How's the shop? Busy season yet? Planning to expand?" He kept his responses steady, honest, measured. Grace was asked what she did. She answered simply, "I used to work in healthcare." No embellishment, no apology. A woman at the table nodded politely and moved on to discussing a real estate conference in Chicago. Grace noticed everything. Who interrupted? Who listened? Who leaned forward when someone spoke and who scanned the room for someone more important? Daniel noticed Grace noticing. At one point, Grant approached Daniel privately near the bar. "I admire consistency," Grant said. "Running your own business takes grit." Daniel appreciated that. It felt genuine. "But the town's changing," Grant continued. "There's opportunity in alignment." Alignment. Daniel understood the language. Partnerships, buyouts, consolidation. It was not a warning. It was a forecast. Caroline rejoined them, resting her hand lightly against Grant's sleeve. Her posture was relaxed, secure. "Lily doing well?" she asked Daniel. "She is," he replied. Caroline smiled. "That's important. Kids need strong foundations." There it was again. Foundation. Stability. Structure. The words were not weapons, but they were reminders. Grace touched Daniel's elbow lightly, grounding him. Across the room, a guest complimented the upcoming property expansion near the southern block. "That area is going to look completely different in a year," someone said. Daniel pictured his shop in the middle of that projection. Different, or gone. The imbalance was undeniable. Grant represented growth capital. Caroline represented refined ambition. They were not villains standing across from him. They were simply operating at a scale Daniel had never aimed for. But scale influences courts. Scale influences perception. Scale influences who looks stable. Grace leaned slightly toward Daniel as the dinner wound down. "You don't talk like someone small," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "Doesn't feel that way in here." She scanned the room again. "Some people build buildings," she said. "Some people build trust. They're not the same thing." Daniel watched Grant laugh confidently with the circle of investors. He watched Caroline glow under chandelier light. They looked like the future. He felt like maintenance. And yet, when his phone buzzed with a photo from Lily's babysitter, Lily grinning with a missing tooth, Daniel's chest steadied. He was not competing for admiration. He was protecting something far more fragile. As the evening ended, Caroline hugged him lightly. "I hope tomorrow goes smoothly," she said. "So do I," Daniel replied. Grant shook his hand again, firm and controlled. "See you at the ceremony." Walking out of the country club, Daniel felt the weight of contrast pressing in from all sides. Grace broke the silence as they reached his truck. "They're not bad people," she said. "No," Daniel agreed. "They just don't realize how heavy their world feels to someone outside it." Daniel started the engine slowly. Tomorrow, that world would turn its attention fully on him, and he could not afford to look like he did not belong. The wedding morning dawned bright and humid, the kind of late summer heat that made dress shirts cling before noon. White chairs lined the lawn behind the estate, facing a wooden arch wrapped in pale roses. Servers moved quickly between tables, adjusting linens and polishing glassware, while guests began arriving in clusters. Daniel had just helped Lily straighten a bow in her hair when a sharp grinding sound echoed near the estate entrance. Heads turned. A large catering truck sat at an awkward angle in the gravel drive, smoke curling from beneath the hood. The driver jumped down, lifting it open in a rush of panic. The scent of overheated metal drifted across the lawn. Within minutes, tension spread through the staff. Without that truck, half the reception food would not make it to the kitchen on time. The event planner, a young woman in heels too thin for gravel, pressed a phone to her ear and spoke in tight, frantic whispers. Guests murmured. A few began checking watches. Caroline stood near the veranda, concern tightening her smile. Grant moved toward the entrance, his jaw set. "What's the delay?" he asked calmly but firmly. The driver stammered something about a stalled engine and failed ignition. Daniel felt Lily's hand tug his sleeve. "Is the wedding going to stop?" she whispered. He crouched slightly. "No, sweetheart. It'll be fine." Then he stood and walked toward the truck without making an announcement. The driver looked up nervously as Daniel approached. "You know engines?" he asked. Daniel nodded once. "Mind if I take a look?" The driver stepped aside, relief visible. Daniel rolled up his sleeves and leaned into the open hood. Heat radiated from the engine block. He listened first, not to the people behind him, but to the subtle clicking of cooling metal. Within minutes, he diagnosed the issue: a loose battery terminal combined with a failing starter relay. He did not have a full toolbox, just the small emergency kit from his truck. He worked carefully, tightening connections, adjusting wiring, tapping the relay housing gently with the handle of a wrench. Guests watched from a distance. Grant stood beside the driver, arms folded but attentive. "Is it serious?" Caroline asked from a few steps back. Daniel did not answer immediately. He focused. Finally, he stepped back and nodded to the driver. "Try it now." The engine coughed once, then roared to life. A quiet cheer rose from the catering staff. The event planner let out a visible breath, pressing a hand to her chest. Grant looked at Daniel, something shifting in his expression. Not surprise, but recalibration. "Thank you," Grant said, and this time there was no formality in his tone. Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and shrugged slightly. Loose connection should hold. He did not linger for praise. He returned to Lily, who looked up at him with wide admiration. "You fixed it," she said, as if he had repaired something far greater than a truck. "Just did my job," he replied softly. Meanwhile, Grace had moved quietly through the chaos in her own way. When the event planner nearly burst into tears from the delay, Grace steadied her. "It's under control," she said gently. "Take a breath." When a young flower girl tripped and scraped her knee on the gravel, Grace knelt instantly, assessing the minor cut with practiced hands. "You're brave," she told the child while cleaning the scrape with bottled water and a clean napkin. "It'll sting for a second, but then you'll be fine." Parents nearby noticed her calm efficiency. Later, as guests gathered under the tent, Grace found herself seated beside a middle-aged couple discussing local healthcare shortages. She listened before speaking. "There's a shortage of rural nurses across the state," she said thoughtfully. "Most clinics can't retain staff without better funding structures." Her voice was steady, informed. "You worked in healthcare?" the woman asked. "I did," Grace answered simply. There was no mention of what she had lost, no trace of resentment, just knowledge. Daniel observed her from across the table. She was not performing. She was participating. Gradually, conversation shifted. Guests who had initially glanced at Daniel with curiosity now nodded at him with quiet respect. Caroline noticed it too. She watched as Grant spoke privately with Daniel near the beverage table. "Didn't realize you were that good under pressure," Grant said. Daniel gave a modest smile. "Engines don't lie, they just need patience." Grant chuckled lightly. It was a small exchange, but it mattered. For the first time that weekend, Daniel did not feel like an afterthought. He felt useful. Caroline approached shortly after, her posture composed. "Thank you for helping," she said sincerely. "Of course," Daniel replied. There was no sarcasm, no competition, just a moment of shared practicality. As the ceremony began, the earlier tension had softened. The truck sat quietly off to the side, running smoothly. The guests were fed. The planner was smiling again. Daniel returned to his seat beside Lily. He had not tried to impress anyone. He had simply stepped forward when something needed fixing. Grace caught his eye across the aisle and offered a small nod, acknowledgement without spectacle. In a room filled with wealth, projections, and future developments, Daniel had proven something without saying a word. He was steady, and for the first time since the divorce, that steadiness did not feel small. By the time the reception began, the earlier tension from the catering truck had faded into polite celebration. String lights glowed overhead as twilight settled over the estate. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose in warm waves. Servers moved gracefully between tables. Daniel sat with Lily at a round table near the edge of the tent. Grace sat beside him, posture relaxed but alert, as though she always anticipated the shift in a room before it happened. For a while, it felt almost normal. Lily twirled in her small lavender dress. Guests complimented Daniel on the repair earlier. Someone even joked about bringing their pickup truck by his shop next week. Daniel allowed himself to breathe. Then it started. A woman near the bar narrowed her eyes as she looked toward Grace. She whispered something to her husband. He glanced again, longer this time. Across the tent, a younger man leaned toward another guest and murmured, "Isn't that the woman who sits near Mercer's shop?" The whisper spread softly at first. Curious, uncertain. Grace felt it before Daniel did. The subtle shift in tone, the glances that lingered too long. Daniel noticed when one of Grant's business associates excused himself mid-conversation and began scrolling on his phone, likely searching social media, trying to place her. Caroline approached their table with careful composure. Her smile was tight now. "Daniel," she said quietly, "can I speak with you?" He stood, sensing the temperature change. They stepped just outside the tent where music muffled their voices, but not their tension. "What's going on?" Daniel asked. Caroline's expression was not furious. It was controlled, which was worse. "I'm hearing things," she said. "People are asking questions about your guest." "She's my guest," Daniel replied evenly. "Daniel," Caroline lowered her voice, "if she's who I think she is, this isn't appropriate, especially with Lily here." There it was. "She hasn't done anything wrong," Daniel said. Caroline exhaled sharply. "You don't see the optics. Grant's investors are here. Community leaders, judges attend events like this. If people start questioning your judgment—" "My judgment," Daniel repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. "She doesn't have stable housing," Caroline said bluntly. "You think that won't be noticed?" Daniel felt heat rise in his chest. "She's a person," he said. "And Lily is your responsibility," Caroline snapped, the first crack in her calm exterior. The words landed like a threat disguised as concern. Behind them, the music swelled as Grant stepped outside as well, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" Grant asked. Caroline did not hesitate. "Daniel brought someone who may not be stable." Grant looked from Caroline to Daniel, then toward the tent where Grace sat alone at the table with Lily. "Daniel," Grant said carefully, "you know how perception works in a town like this. People talk. So let them. Daniel replied. It's not that simple, Grant continued. Custody discussions don't happen in isolation. Reputation matters. Daniel's jaw tightened. They were not yelling. They were speaking, rationally, calmly. That made it worse. Inside the tent, a guest's voice grew louder. Isn't she homeless? The word traveled faster than the earlier whispers. Heads turned openly now. Lily looked up at Grace. What does homeless mean? She asked innocently. Grace froze for half a second, then softened. It means someone doesn't have a house right now, she said gently. Before Lily could ask more, Caroline stepped back into the tent, microphone in hand. The band quieted instinctively. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Caroline's voice carried easily across the tables. I just want to clarify something, she said, smiling tightly. It's come to our attention that one of our guests may not be exactly who she presented herself as. Silence stretched thin. Daniel moved forward instinctively, but Grant's hand lightly touched his arm. Let her handle it, Grant murmured. Handle it. Caroline's eyes landed on Grace. It's important, she continued, that we're honest about stability, especially when children are involved. Lily's small fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he barely heard the next sentence. She doesn't even have an address, Caroline said clearly. Gasps rippled through the tent. Daniel stepped fully forward now. Caroline, stop! But the damage was already done. Grace stood slowly, every movement deliberate. She did not rush. She did not flinch. She's right, Grace said, her voice steady despite the 100 eyes on her. I don't have permanent housing right now. The air felt electric. Daniel felt as though the ground beneath him had opened. This was his worst fear. Not embarrassment, but public doubt about his ability to protect his daughter. Someone near the back whispered, "He brought her around his kid?" Lily looked between the adults, confusion tightening her expression. "Daddy," she said quietly. Daniel crouched beside her immediately, shielding her from the noise. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're okay." But inside, panic surged. Grace continued, her voice unwavering. "That doesn't mean I'm unstable," she said. "It means life knocked me down." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Caroline's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "No one is attacking you," Caroline said. "We just believe children deserve secure environments." The implication was clear. Daniel stood facing the crowd now. "She has done nothing wrong," he said firmly. Grant stepped forward as well, his voice measured. "This isn't about morality. It's about perception. We all have responsibilities." Responsibilities. Daniel understood the coded language. Investors, judges, community boards, custody. The whispers intensified. For a split second, Daniel considered walking away, taking Lily's hand, leaving before things worsened. But Lily's voice cut through the noise. "Grace helped that little girl earlier," she said loudly, "and she fixed her knee." The simplicity of it silenced a few nearby guests. Grace's eyes shimmered briefly, but she remained composed. Daniel realized in that moment that the humiliation was not just his, it was Lily's. It was Grace's. And it was happening because he had wanted to prove he was not broken. Now everything he feared, instability, judgment, doubt, stood exposed under chandelier lights. The celebration had shifted into something colder. Daniel felt the weight of every glance, every assumption, and for the first time that evening, he truly understood how quickly perception could become weaponized. The music never fully recovered. Someone signaled the band to resume playing, but the melody came back thin and uncertain, like it didn't belong anymore. Conversations restarted in careful fragments. Chairs scraped softly against the wooden dance floor. Daniel felt every shift in tone like pressure against his ribs. He stood near the edge of the tent, Lily's hand wrapped tightly around his fingers. Grace remained a few feet away, still composed, though the air around her had changed. Guests no longer leaned toward her with curiosity. They leaned away with caution. Caroline had stepped back to Grant's side, her posture upright, her smile restored for appearances. But Daniel knew that look. It was the same one she used during mediation, composed, strategic, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Grant's expression had gone analytical, not angry, not emotional, calculating. Daniel could almost see it unfolding behind his eyes. Investors present, community leaders watching. A single father publicly associated with someone the town viewed as unstable. Optics. The word echoed. Lily tugged at his sleeve again. Her voice was small now. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" The question hit harder than any whisper in the room. Daniel knelt in front of her, steadying himself before answering. "No," he said gently. "We didn't do anything wrong." Her brow furrowed. "Then why are people looking at us like that?" He did not have an answer she would understand. Because adults turn fear into judgment. Because people confuse housing with worth. Because perception can be weaponized. Instead, he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes people don't understand things right away." Lily nodded slowly, though confusion lingered in her eyes. Across the tent, Grace approached quietly. "I'm sorry," she said to Daniel, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "This wasn't supposed to hurt you." "It's not your fault," he replied automatically. But doubt crept in. Had he been reckless? Had he let pride override caution? Grace glanced toward Lily, then back at Daniel. "I can leave," she said softly. That would settle it. The offer was not defensive, it was protective. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her. She stood there with dignity intact, even after being exposed under a microphone in front of strangers. She was not angry. She was not ashamed. She was unashamed. She was offering to step away to reduce damage. Damage. That word twisted inside him. Caroline's earlier comment about stability replayed in his mind. Judges attend events like this. Reputation matters. If Caroline documented tonight, if she presented it as questionable judgment, it could reopen custody discussions. Even if she never intended to, the possibility hung heavy. Daniel felt suddenly exhausted. He imagined standing in a courtroom again, explaining why he brought a homeless woman to a wedding, explaining that it was not irresponsible, explaining that Grace had never posed danger, explaining pride. Grace's voice broke through his thoughts. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I agreed to come knowing it could get messy." Daniel swallowed. The wedding atmosphere had shifted completely now. Conversations were guarded, laughter forced. Guests avoided eye contact or offered polite, distant smiles. Grant approached them once more, measured as always. "This escalated faster than expected," he said calmly. Daniel did not respond. Grant continued, "Caroline is concerned about how this may be interpreted." "Interpreted by who?" Daniel asked quietly. Grant paused. "Anyone whose opinion influences your future." There it was again. Future. Daniel looked down at Lily. Her entire world was contained in his ability to provide stability. School mornings, bedtime stories, Saturday pancakes. If he jeopardized that for pride, what would that make him? Grace stepped slightly back, giving Daniel space to decide. Inside his chest, 2 instincts fought each other. One said, "Protect yourself. Step away. Apologize publicly. Distance your daughter from controversy." The other said, "Protect her, not from Grace, from becoming a man who walks away from someone the moment it becomes inconvenient." Daniel remembered something his father once told him while teaching him to change a tire. "A man shows who he is when something's heavy." Right now, this was heavy. He looked at Grace again. She had not begged. She had not defended herself aggressively. She had simply told the truth. Daniel realized the real danger was not embarrassment. It was modeling cowardice. If Lily watched him retreat from someone who had done nothing wrong, what lesson would she carry? That reputation matters more than integrity? That standing beside someone costs too much? Grace gave him a small nod as if she understood the war inside him. Caroline's laughter rang from across the tent, slightly too loud, a signal that she was attempting to reset the mood. Grant scanned the room again, assessing damage control. Daniel felt the weight of optics, lawyers, influence. But then Lily slipped her hand back into his. "I like her," she whispered. "Simple, honest." Daniel exhaled slowly. The humiliation still burned. The fear of legal consequences still hovered. But beneath all of it was a quieter truth. If he protected his image at the expense of someone's dignity, especially in front of his daughter, he would lose something far more permanent than reputation. He would lose the version of himself Lily believed in, and that, more than custody threats or whispered judgments, terrified him most. The band had stopped pretending to play. Conversations thinned into awkward clusters. The air felt thick, as though the entire tent were holding its breath. Grace stood still for a moment, then stepped toward the small platform where the microphone rested on its stand. Daniel instinctively reached for her wrist. "You don't have to," he said quietly. She gave him a small, steady look. "I know." Then she walked forward on her own. He felt Lily's hand tighten in his. Grace picked up the microphone without rushing. The feedback hummed briefly before fading. 100 eyes followed her. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," she began, her voice calm and clear. "But since my situation has become part of the program, I think honesty is the only fair option." There was no tremor in her tone. "I worked as a registered nurse for 8 years," she continued, "most of that time in a rural emergency department. I loved that job. I was good at it. A few guests shifted, surprised. My mother became ill 2 years ago. Cancer. The kind that doesn't negotiate. I left work to care for her. The hospital downsized during that time. When I tried to return, the position was gone." She paused, letting the facts settle. Medical debt piled up. Savings disappeared. Rent followed. The story was not dramatic. It was measured. Plain. "I don't have permanent housing right now," she said again. "That's true. But I'm not unstable. I'm not dangerous. I'm not dishonest." Her eyes swept across the room, not pleading, just steady. "Daniel did not ask me to lie about who I am. He didn't script a story. He didn't tell me to hide." Daniel felt something inside him shift. "He offered me respect," Grace said. "And that matters more than an address." A few guests looked down at their plates. Grace turned slightly toward Daniel and Lily. "I agreed to come tonight because I thought I was helping him prove something," she admitted. "But the only thing he's proven is that he treats people with dignity when it would be easier not to." Silence stretched across the tent. Then she said the words that landed heavier than anything else. "The only person here who showed my daughter kindness tonight was him." The word daughter hung in the air. Everyone understood she did not mean Lily. She meant herself. A ripple passed through the crowd, not of shock this time, but recognition. Grant stepped forward slowly. His posture remained composed, but something in his expression had changed. Less calculation, more clarity. "Grace," he said evenly, "I owe you an apology." Caroline looked at him surprised. Grant continued, projecting his voice without the microphone. "I reacted to perception," he admitted, "not to character." He turned toward Daniel. "And I misjudged you." Daniel did not move. Grant extended his hand publicly. "I've built a career on assessing risk," he said. But integrity isn't always easy to measure in a room like this. A quiet murmur of agreement moved through several guests. Caroline stood frozen for a moment longer. The tension in her shoulders softened slowly, as if pride were being negotiated internally. She stepped forward next. "I was wrong to handle it that way," she said, her voice less polished now, more human. "I let fear of judgment override fairness." The admission was small but visible. Daniel felt the heat in his chest cool slightly. The power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation, but through exposure. Grace lowered the microphone and stepped back. Daniel walked forward this time, not defensively, not aggressively, simply steady. He did not take the microphone. He did not raise his voice. "My daughter deserves to see me stand by people," he said clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "especially when it's uncomfortable." He glanced down at Lily, who was watching him with wide eyes. "That's the only example I care about." There was no anger in his tone, no accusation, just clarity. The room, once thick with suspicion, seemed to exhale. One by one, guests began nodding. Conversations resumed, not in whispers but openly. A woman from earlier approached Grace with a quiet, "Thank you for what you did for that little girl." The event planner, who had nearly cried hours earlier, gave Daniel a grateful smile. Grant shook Daniel's hand firmly this time, not as an assessment, but as acknowledgement. "Let's talk next week," Grant said quietly, "about the shop." Caroline looked at Daniel with something different now. Not comparison, not superiority, recognition. She crouched slightly beside Lily. "You okay?" she asked gently. Lily nodded. "Daddy didn't do anything wrong." Caroline swallowed and stood back up. The music started again, stronger this time. The humiliation that had hovered moments earlier dissolved into something steadier. Respect. Daniel returned to his seat beside Lily and Grace. He had not won an argument. He had not embarrassed anyone. He had simply chosen who he wanted his daughter to see him be. And in that choice, the balance of the entire room had quietly shifted. The town of Ashford Hollow had a short memory for scandal and a long memory for character. Within a week of the wedding, the whispers had changed tone. What had started as gossip quietly turned into something closer to respect. People remembered the catering truck. They remembered the calm way Grace handled the scraped knee. They remembered the way Daniel had stood without shouting. Grant Holloway called the shop the following Monday. Daniel almost let it go to voicemail. He answered on the third ring. "I've been reviewing our fleet maintenance contracts," Grant said without preamble. "We're expanding to 3 additional properties this fall. I prefer to work with people I've seen under pressure." Daniel wiped grease from his hands and leaned against the workbench. "You got bigger operations in Columbus," he said carefully. "I do," Grant replied. "But I don't need bigger. I need reliable." There was no mention of the wedding, no apology repeated, just business. 2 days later, Daniel signed a contract to service Holloway Development's local vehicles, a steady, predictable stream of work that stabilized his projections for the next year. It was not charity, it was earned. Caroline noticed the shift too. A week after the contract was finalized, she requested coffee at a quiet cafe near Lily's school. There were no raised voices this time, no references to stability used as leverage. "I don't want tension," Caroline said honestly. "Not for Lily." Daniel nodded. "Neither do I." The conversation was measured, calm. Caroline did not retract her concerns entirely, but the sharp edge had dulled. There were no threats about revisiting custody, no subtle comments about optics. Something had changed. Perhaps she had seen what Lily saw that night, not recklessness, but steadiness. Grace's path shifted more slowly, but just as meaningfully. The story of the wedding traveled in fragments through town. A nurse from a local clinic recognized Grace's name and reached out quietly. There was a staffing shortage in Ashford Hollow's Community Health Center, part-time hours at first, then potentially more. Grace showed up with her credentials and her experience intact. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for a chance. Within 2 weeks, she was back in scrubs. Daniel did not rescue her. He did not pay her rent in secret. Instead, he drove her to view a small one-bedroom apartment above a bakery on Main Street. The place smelled faintly of cinnamon and sugar. The floors creaked. The windows overlooked the square. "It's small," Grace said, smiling faintly. "It's yours," Daniel replied. She used her first paycheck and part of the money he had originally offered her to secure the deposit. No debts between them, just gratitude. Lily adjusted to the changes in her own quiet way. Grace began stopping by the house on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes they drew pictures at the kitchen table. Sometimes Grace brought library books and read aloud in a steady, warm voice that made Lily lean closer. Daniel would stand in the doorway sometimes and watch them, not as a man trying to prove anything, but as a father noticing the calm in his home. The tension that had once wrapped around his chest began to loosen. The shop ran steadily now. The redevelopment across the street no longer felt like a threat. It felt like change he could navigate. Daniel stopped tracking Caroline's social media, stopped comparing square footage, vacations, and business headlines. He no longer felt like he was competing for worth. One evening, after closing up the shop, Daniel sat on the hood of his truck and watched the sun dip behind the grain silos at the edge of town. Grace walked up from the bakery apartment, waving lightly. "Long day?" she asked. "Good day," he answered. There was no performance in his tone. He felt lighter, not because he had won something, but because he had stopped trying to measure himself against someone else's scale. Billy ran out of the house barefoot, laughing, holding up a drawing she had made of the three of them standing under a tent with bright lights. "You look serious," Lily told him, pointing to the sketch of him in a suit. "I was serious," he admitted. Grace laughed softly, but the drawing showed something else too. 3 figures standing close together, steady. For the first time in a long time, Daniel realized he was no longer bracing for judgment. He was simply living. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window, steady and familiar, nothing like the storm of whispers from weeks before. The house smelled of cocoa and toasted marshmallows. Billy stood on a wooden chair at the counter, carefully stirring a mug of hot chocolate with both hands. Her tongue peeked out in concentration. "Don't spill," Daniel said gently, leaning against the fridge. "I won't," she replied with dramatic seriousness. A knock came at the door. Grace stepped inside moments later, shaking rain from her coat and holding a slim folder against her chest. "Official paperwork," she said with a small smile. "Full-time hours starting next month." Lily gasped like it was the most important news in the world. "That means you're really a nurse again." Grace crouched to Lily's height. "I never stopped being one. I just needed a place to practice." Daniel watched the exchange quietly. There was no spotlight, no audience, no one measuring stability or perception, just a small kitchen, warm light, and the quiet rebuilding of ordinary life. They sat at the table together. Lily laughed when marshmallow foam stuck to Daniel's upper lip. Grace filled out the last page of her employment packet, steady and focused. Later that night, Daniel tucked Lily into bed. The rain had softened to a whisper. She wrapped her arms around his neck before he could stand. "You're my hero, Daddy," she murmured sleepily. Daniel swallowed, brushing her hair back from her forehead. He had not won anything dramatic. He had not embarrassed anyone into silence. He had simply chosen to stand steady when it would have been easier to step back. He turned off the light and closed her bedroom door halfway, listening to the calm rhythm of her breathing. Strength, he realized, was not about proving you were enough. It was about showing up, even when it's heavy. If this story touched you, subscribe to Just Dad Things for more single dad stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.